Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this very special edition of State of the World on the Global Economy with Paul Donovan of UBS. Right now, it's my pleasure to welcome a great friend of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and one of our most trusted senior advisors, Tom Lips. Tom?
Thank you, Megan, and welcome WAC viewers from near and far. And I personally send greetings from the mountains of Mexico, where I spend the winter months with a return to El Norte scheduled for this Friday. My association with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut is well into its third decade, and I applaud Megan Torrey in particular for her superb leadership and the substantive events she has brought to the members. Today is a perfect case in point. And to that end, I'm delighted to introduce my UBS Wealth Management colleague, Paul Leeming, who will moderate this session with our chief economist, Paul Donovan. Now, just a quick bio on Paul Leeming. He is a new member of the WAC Connecticut, I'm happy to tell you, and helped secure Paul Donovan for this afternoon's discussion. Paul lives in Stonington with his family and joined my own UBS Long River Wealth Management Group in Hartford in January of 2020. He came from the UBS Chief Investment Office in New York, where he worked closely with senior colleagues like Paul Donovan. Paul Leeming, like all of our viewers, has a deep interest in world affairs. And I might add, it seems to run in the family. His father, in an earlier life, was in government at an undisclosed agency doing undisclosed heavy lifting. His father-in-law, now retired, was a US ambassador to Lebanon as well as Tunisia. So, welcome Paul Leeming, and please introduce our guest speaker.
Well, thank you, Tom, very much for those words. It's a privilege to be here, and I do send best wishes from my father-in-law, John McCarthy, who was said ambassador to Tunisia and Lebanon, and a member for a long time of this very council. So he sends his best and is no doubt listening today. But I also want to thank Megan for including us in this forum today. The World Affairs Council is a wonderful organization, and Megan, under your leadership, it continues to engage the community and enrich the dialogue in so many ways. So we're very honored to be here. I'm also privileged to moderate this conversation today and to welcome our guest speaker, Paul Donovan. Paul is the chief economist for UBS Global Wealth Management and a member of the UBS Global Investment Committee. Paul is an opinion leader within and outside of the firm, and you may have already heard or read his voice as he is frequently featured in the financial press. Paul is a member of UBS Pride, a member of the UBS Art Board, a part of the UBS Nobel Perspectives Program, and a supporter of the UBS Women in Economics program. He has an MA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford University, and a Master of Science in Financial Economics from the University of London. I'll just add that I love Paul's online bio, which shares that in his spare time, Paul is an amateur heavyweight boxer, a quote, keen, if very definitively amateur skier, and a small-scale farmer with apples, pears, and sheep. I actually had the pleasure, as Tom mentioned, of working with Paul before I became a financial advisor, and I came to truly admire not only his clear mastery of economics and world affairs, but also the clarity and originality with which he presents his views. And I hope and trust you'll share that opinion after the call today. So, Paul, stop embarrassing you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us from your evening in London.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul.
So, Paul, I'll admit at the open here that I found it difficult to organize topics for this interview because there is simply so much going on across the economic, geopolitical, and financial landscape. You know, how does one narrow this all down to a single hour? But in the end, I decided to structure things as follows, and bear with me here, but I'm going to ask you about the headline topics, but request that you address them through both a short-term and a long-term lens, both obviously interesting time horizons. So jumping right in, let's try this out on the first topic, which is Ukraine. Two-part question, Paul. Number one, how are you assessing this conflict and its impact around the world today? And two, what do you see as the standout long-term ramifications after the fighting is over?
So it's obviously a very topical issue, very interesting issue. I think I would start with a general observation. This is the first European war with a Twitter handle. And war in the era of social media has, I think, different implications. Certainly, I would argue that the unity of the European government's response and the speed of the UK and the European government response to war in Ukraine has in part been motivated by the very, very strong public opinion in Europe and the UK, which itself, I think, has been driven by the social media presence. Now, this is something I think which is having an impact in the short term in my world, in the world of economics and financial markets, in that sentiment has been very, very volatile around this. Just as 2 years ago, everyone was an armchair virologist, now everyone's an armchair general. And the sort of doom scrolling through social media is creating more volatility in response to events in the war, and it's certainly creating a bigger impact in reported sentiment. What I don't think it's necessarily doing is changing economic behavior any more significantly, but the reported sentiment and the volatility of markets has been affected by the role of social media and communication. Because, of course, in the past, war was something you experienced for 15 minutes on the evening news, whereas now it's sort of with you all the time, albeit in a parasocial sense. Looking at the short-term economic implications of this, and if you'll allow me, I'm going to set aside the obvious horrific humanitarian consequences and so on. I hope you all understand that I'm very, very sensitive to that, but my job is as an economist.
Of course.
Essentially, this is a war that is being felt economically primarily through commodity prices. It's a commodity price shock. The uncertainty around energy supplies, the uncertainty around the willingness of Europe to accept energy supplies, the potential disruption to particularly the oil and gas market has been quite strong. And that has economic implications because, of course, it is impacting inflation, it impacts demand in the economy. A commodity price shock, as always, is a price inflation shock and a growth deflation shock simultaneously. And that's the primary short-term consequence that we're getting from this. Economic sanctions, they matter to individual companies, absolutely. And I think we've got three forms of sanctions here. We've got the official sanctions, we've got what I call the Twitter sanctions or the social media sanctions, where companies are scared of reputational damage and are pulling out. So McDonald's, good case in point. And then we've got the second round effects of the financial sanctions. So even if you're exempt from sanctions against Russia, the chances are your Russian clients can't afford what you're selling anymore. So we've got sanctions which matter at a corporate level, but at a macroeconomic level, they really don't matter that much. Before the invasion, Russia was about 2% of global GDP at market prices. To put that in context, it's 1/3 the size of the Californian economy. I'm not going to be changing my US economic forecasts on sanctions being applied to an economy as insignificant as that. So it's mainly around the commodity prices that we're going to experience this in the short term. In the longer term, I think there are more significant questions around patterns of global trade. We are further adding risk to supply chains, essentially. The concept of food security, the concept of energy security, which you've taken to an extreme, is the concept of autarky. That, I think, is going to get a further boost from this situation. We are also, I think, going to see more questions around what is going to be happening with regards to financial instruments, the security of financial instruments. I think a number of people have been shocked at sanctions applied to the Russian central bank. And I've had some people express, well, you're stealing Russia's money. But of course, to paraphrase Kissinger, it's our money but your problem. And this is not unprecedented, but it's being applied to a UN Security Council member, it's being applied to a member of the G20, and that is unprecedented. So I think that we will see more angst around how reserves are held over the longer term, how reserves are managed, what is actually, a safe asset for an international organization or government to hold. I don't believe, to be absolutely clear, the dollar is going to lose its reserve status. There just isn't an alternative to the dollar as a reserve at the moment. And as I would repeatedly point out, it took 2 world wars and the loss of empire for sterling to lose reserve status, and it's still the 3rd largest reserve currency in the world. So I don't think that this is about dethroning the dollar or anything like that over the longer term, but I think that there's going to be certainly more ingenuity about how reserves are managed over the longer term, and more ways of examining how sovereigns in particular are going to be managing their money. So short term, we're talking about a straightforward commodity shock and the trade-off between price inflation and growth deflation. Longer term, it's more about security of trade, questioning the dependence on international trade, and some questions around the longer term ramifications of financial sanctions.
So, Paul, you touched on a number of topics there on the subject of Ukraine, and we could, of course, spend this whole call talking about Ukraine. But in the interest of time and the number of topics of interest today, I'm going to jump around a bit. But each of these questions is sort of woven with the other, and somewhere in that last response, you talked about the impact of the Russian invasion and the sanctions on the prices of food and energy. I'd like to build on that by asking you to comment on inflation more broadly. As we all know, prices were elevated before the conflict as the result of COVID and other factors. And as we also know, the initial classifications of these price pressures moved at first from transitory to tenacious to nobody really knows. So following our sort of short-term and long-term approach here, I suppose the short-term question is, when and to what level do you think these high inflation readings will abate? And then the long-term question in my mind is, what forces are likely to impact inflation in the long term?
So I would say inflation is transitory, but that's an economist's definition of transitory. When an economist calls inflation transitory, we mean it lasts 12 months. When a politician hears inflation is transitory, they think it lasts 12 weeks. And if a foreign exchange dealer hears inflation is transitory, they think it lasts 12 minutes. So you've got here a range. And actually, the inflation numbers we saw yesterday in the States, to my mind, are showing that the inflation is transitory. Because what we are seeing is the areas of inflation that were being driven up by this extraordinary surge in demand last year. I mean, the US had the strongest surge in demand for goods in 75 years. This is a once-in-3-generation event. So yes, of course, monetary prices are going to go up in response to that. But the prices that were going up, they're now slowing down. Either the inflation is coming down, or in several cases, we've actually gone into outright deflation. Prices are falling, used cars, for example. So the fact that the demand surge has sort of come back down to normal has meant that the price surge has come back down to normal. Rather unfortunately, at just the moment that that's happening, we then had commodity prices going up because of war. So, we had the once in three generation shock of this extraordinary demand surge giving us a transitory boost to inflation. And just at the moment that we're turning that around and very, very visibly turning that around in the detail of the data, we then go and have a war, which adds into the price story. Now, looking at what is happening, inflation, I think, peaked in the States in March, so the inflation rate is going to be coming down. And there's three reasons for that. Firstly, the prices that were going up are now slowing down, as I've already said. So the normalization of demand is already normalizing prices. Second, base effects. If you think about it, the March inflation data is comparing prices now in a normal economy with prices in March 2021 when the US was still more or less in lockdown. I mean, I know Texas had opened up, but essentially the US was still in lockdown in March 2021. Next month, we're going to be comparing prices in April 2022, a normal economy, with prices in an economy that is opening up. And then by the summer, we'll be comparing prices in a normal economy in June, say, with prices in a normal economy in June 2021. So that inevitably is going to start to lower the inflation story. And then the third thing, I think, which is going to be pushing inflation down is the absence of a problem in the labor market that is inflationary. We simply do not have a wage cost price spiral. And that's what would make inflation more enduring. Now, we've got to be very careful here. I'm not talking about wages, I'm talking about wage costs. Because as I frequently have occasion to remind our beloved chief exec, Ralph Hammers, if you pay an economist more money because they are working harder, this is not inflationary, this is a very good thing and should be encouraged.
How does that work for you,
what
Paul?
is happening? Well, what's happening in the States now? What we've got in the States is GDP output is above pre-pandemic levels, but employment is still below pre-pandemic levels. So in other words, you've got fewer people producing more stuff. They're working harder. And a lot of the wage growth that we've been seeing has actually been because people have been working harder. So when you adjust for that fact, the wage costs are behaving perfectly normally. Unit labor costs, which is what economists look at, behaving perfectly normally. That might change in the future. It's something I'm constantly monitoring. But right now, that gives me this idea that inflation is going to be settling down in the second half of this year. Now, in the longer term, we, I think, are fundamentally going to be looking at a fairly subdued inflation environment, but I think at one which is probably more volatile. The reason for this is the structural change that economists call the fourth industrial revolution. So this is automation, robotics, digitization, all this kind of good stuff. Now, the upshot of the fourth industrial revolution, in my view, is greater efficiency. We're going to be more efficient about how we use the resources we've got. And that's more efficient in an environmental sense. It's more efficient in an economic sense. And efficiency means, effectively over time, we lower price pressures. So if I can give one example, in particular in the UK, but I think it's a global phenomenon, we have seen the pandemic shift attitudes to flexible working from home, and so on and so forth. Now, actually in the UK, UBS has had flexible working since 2016. But there's been a mindset shift. So whereas before the pandemic, I might say, well, I'm going to work in the office unless I've got a reason to work from home. Now, the approach is I'm going to work from home unless I've got a reason to be in the office. And what does that mean? Well, that means that as an economy, we're starting to use our resources a lot more efficiently because I no longer have a home office and a work office, and I'm no longer using two buildings over the course of a day and heating and lighting and all the rest of it. It's condensed into one. and it becomes a lot more efficient. And UBS is saving real estate costs, and it's saving office furniture costs and all the rest of it, because we're using our existing stock of capital more efficiently. I always had a home office, I always had a desk, I always had a laptop computer, but it would be sitting gathering dust during the daytime. And now it's just being used 24/7 because economists never sleep and ceaselessly toil. So a lot more efficiency, and that's generally a disinflation force. I do run into a lot of angst about globalization. And well, globalization is going to reverse. And I was already saying that I think we are going to see problems around global trade coming out of the conflict in Ukraine, and actually as a consequence of the pandemic. But there's a couple of points here. The idea that globalization lowered inflation is one of the great myths of the late 20th century. Globalization almost certainly raised inflation. It didn't lower it. What it caused was a relative price shift. So labor-intensive products came down in price. And of course, that's the manufactured stuff that we all buy and we all see a lot of the time. But commodities went up in price. Why was that? Well, let's take outsourcing to China as an example. Outsource to China, cheap labor, lower the cost of labor-intensive products, all very obvious. But China is a relatively inefficient user of commodities. So China was consuming more commodities when it was making our manufactured products, and the workforce in China had more money, were going out and increasing demand for commodities about which they were an inefficient consumer. So you raised commodities and lowered manufactured prices. It was a relative price shock rather than an overall inflation shock. What we've now got, I would say, is two forces at work, one of which is inflationary, one of which is disinflationary or deflationary. The inflationary force is deglobalization. This is where politicians interfere in free trade through sanctions, through tariffs, whatever it is. So President Trump's trade taxes, the Brexit process, these are examples of deglobalization, where politicians, through their actions, are forcing companies to abandon the most efficient method of production and choose second best. Choosing second best is never a good idea, but that's what these things do. So you create inefficiencies, you create higher prices. But localization is when, using the technology of the fourth industrial revolution, we discover that it's more efficient, it is cheaper to produce closer to the customer. And you cut out inventory costs, you cut out waste, you cut out shipping and transport costs. And by doing this, you can lower prices. And I can give a very practical example, which actually the pandemic has finally actually completed. It accelerated the process already in place, which is entertainment. So film, television, music, computer games, and so on. 10, 15 years ago, the majority of entertainment was purchased in physical form. You'd buy a compact disc, you'd buy a DVD, you'd buy a CD-ROM. Now, those things required manufacturing in 6, 7, 8 different countries to get the finished product. There's an awful lot of trade going on just to get you your Justin Bieber compact disc, Paul. I know you're a fan.
Yes.
And so you've got an enormous amount of trade, an enormous amount of environmental resources going into this. But now, no one buys compact discs, no one buys DVDs. You stream direct to the phone in your pocket. It is the ultimate in local production. Digitization has completely changed this. And what's the result? The cost of entertainment has come crashing down because you're not buying a compact disc. In fact, you don't even buy an album anymore. You buy a track, or you download it for free off Spotify or whatever it is you're doing. And as a result, we're getting a disinflation force. So there are political forces that could be inflationary in the longer term. But if politicians get out of the way and let economists do their jobs, I think that we are going to be seeing a relatively benign inflation environment over the medium term and the longer term.
Fascinating answer. And Paul, I will borrow the description of the differing perspectives of the economist, the politician, and the trader in terms of inflation. That's very interesting. I will also dispute one thing that you said, which is that nobody's buying CDs. My mother is still buying CDs, and in fact, once tried to put one into a tape deck, if that gives you any indication of where some people are, and she's a brilliant woman. But Paul, you touched there on a lot of topics, and I'm going to focus you in on this energy topic, and you brought it up both in the context of Ukraine and in inflation, and clearly there's been a lot of discussion around the motivation to change energy into more renewables, or energy transformation, or green tech, or what you want to call it. And I read a stat the other day from the IEA that I'll admit surprised me, in that it said that 90% of electricity generation should come from renewable sources by 2050. 90% by 2050. And not to be overly simplistic, but that struck me that if that's anything like accurate, essentially everything in the world is going to change. And so I'm curious, can you talk about this transition and its impact geopolitically, strategically, economically, financially? What's this going to look like?
It's an interesting question. Now, I think the IEA are including nuclear in renewable there, but essentially it's quite feasible, I think, in 30 years that we get there. I mean, at the moment in the UK, if the wind is blowing strongly enough, 45–50% of our energy is renewable today, because we have wind farms on the coast. Of course, if the wind isn't blowing, then we have a problem. But it's not that inconceivable. The other thing to remember is that we're not just talking about generation, we're also talking about energy use and energy efficiency. And I come back to the point of the fourth industrial revolution, that one response to the higher oil prices that we're already seeing in the UK is people saying, well, I'm not going to drive to work. Why should I drive to work? I'll work from home, save myself the cost of a tank of fuel in the car. And so you're seeing shifts here. And very noticeable that during the lockdowns in 2020, it varied somewhat from country to country, but typically electricity consumption dropped by about 15%. So this is a mix. We're going to see efficiency as we change how we work and how we shop and so on and so forth. And also we're going to have to see a shift to energy transition. So it's two things side by side. I think it is also important to recognize that over the next 30 years, fossil fuels don't go away. We're going to need fossil fuels for the next 30 years. You turn off the gas, as Germany is demonstrating at the moment. You need to have fossil fuels over the next 30 years. And there will, I think, be a constant tension here, as we've already seen, because as sustainable investing has become more and more mainstream, what we have found is a lot of people have been tending to adopt the exclusion approach, which really doesn't work. So I want my hands clean, I'm not going to touch oil. Mm-hmm. Well, fine, you're hurting the environment that way, because if you're not going to invest in oil, you're not going to invest in greater oil efficiency. We need oil over the next 30 years, and you're saying I want as inefficient an oil system as possible over the next 30 years, just so I can sleep easy at night. That's not the right approach. So what we, I think, are now going to be seeing is a focus on re-engaging with fossil fuels, accepting they're here for the next 30 years, and working out how we can improve efficiency and make the transition as smooth as possible. Now, that's going to require some mindset changes, but I think that what we're going through now with the higher energy prices is going to be part of that process. And it's ESG consistent because you're investing in efficiency, you're smoothing the process. It's also other aspects of ESG investment, the social side, because of course lower income people are affected very badly by higher energy prices. So by smoothing the transition, this is all good. I think that what we will have to see is a process of reevaluating how energy is distributed, how it's used. So do we have grids? Do we have more micro generation? You don't necessarily need a power grid if you can start using renewables more and more, solar panels on your roof and a battery. And that's becoming very, very common in rural England where I am. This is more and more the case. So you're going to see starts changing approaches to how we connect with one another and what the infrastructure is going to be required. And that changes resource demand, and that's going to be quite significant with implications beyond just the energy producers. Copper producers, for example, may find that there's less demand for copper because if you don't have an energy grid, you don't need nearly as many copper wires as you have done in the past. All sorts of things like this need to be considered. For the major energy producers, essentially here we're talking the Middle East. Now I know the United States is the largest energy producer, oil producer in the world now, and I know this is big in Texas and all the rest of it, but the US is a diversified economy. Saudi Arabia, not so much. The regimes in the Middle East, for the most part, realize this. There are one or two, Kuwait perhaps, where I would suggest progress is slower. But I think that there is a greater recognition that these countries need to do more to diversify their economies. They've got one generation left in which to do this, and they've got to get a move on. Some have followed the Norwegian example and built up overseas assets, which will help with the transition, but they're not going to be nearly enough. Now, the interesting thing about this region, it's a double-edged sword, is that a lot of the Middle East has a very young population, and that's a very valuable economic asset at a time when populations in Europe and the United States and Asia are aging very rapidly. Having a youthful population is a potential positive, but of course a youthful population that is discontent because the transition has not been managed smoothly enough is also a very dangerous situation. And you can all remember the Arab Spring. So I think that the challenge is going to be making the transition as smooth as possible. And that's not going to be easy, and it is going to have its ups and downs. I am generally fairly optimistic that we will manage this because of the way that a lot of the countries in the Gulf are already going, the way that other countries are already starting to embrace the changes required for a move to renewables. But it's never going to be something which is 100% smooth. We're always going to have bumps along the way.
Paul, earlier you mentioned the shift we've all made from armchair virologist to armchair general, and referencing the shifting attention from COVID-19 to Ukraine. But I'd like to ask you to comment on the coronavirus and hopefully as we move from pandemic to endemic, would you share your thinking on this devastating chapter in our history, once again, in terms of where we are at this moment and what you think the long-term impact might be when we look back at this virus years or even generations from now?
I think in the short term, it rather depends where you are. So the United States, as we already discussed, you have this 75-year high in the surge in demand. And what's caused that is the fact that the United States accumulated a great deal of savings during the pandemic. How did you accumulate the savings? Well, government gave you generous unemployment benefit, 2 stimulus checks, and no one could spend them. So that gives you then this sort of explosion of consumption once the ability to leave the house is allowed. Europe is behind because it didn't give so much money to its consumers, but also because it opened up later. And so Europe has still got some of that spending firepower that the US had last year, whereas at least for low-income Americans, the bottom 50% by income distribution, US households have spent the money. That's gone. And so the US is in a slightly different position from Europe. The UK, as ever, is somewhere adrift in the mid-Atlantic between the two. So where we are now in terms of the aftermath of the pandemic, I think that there is a slight difference in terms of the economic position. I think that there will be more attention in the near term on healthcare spending, but probably quite broadly, I think about stockpiling, preparedness. There is, generally speaking, more respect for healthcare. I mean, let's leave aside fringe views on obscure social media platforms, but for the most part, there's a lot more respect for the healthcare process. We've already discussed, though, that the pandemic has accelerated quite a lot of structural change, and it's working from home, online retail. This is a transition that was going to happen, but was forced to happen a lot faster because of the pandemic. Once you've made these changes, you don't go back very easily because people adjust to the new way of doing things and discover they like it. So I can remember at the start of the pandemic, the painful conversations my brother and I were having with my mother, instructing her in steps how to order her groceries online. And she's saying, no, I'll just go to the store. You can't go to the store. This is what you got to stay at home. Click this button. Now click this. And it took forever. Now, when I have my weekly phone conversations with my mother, she is recounting the online price discounts that she has discovered. My mother is not a fan of technology. She is a massive fan of online price discounts. She knows her delivery driver by name. That's it. She's not going back. And that process, entropy in effect, is going to be one of the long-term consequences that comes out of this. As I've already said, people are now sitting there and saying, I'm working from home unless I've got a reason to go to the office. That's a really, really dramatic psychological shift, I think. What I would really like to see come out of the pandemic in the long term, and I absolutely know is not going to happen, is for people to realize that humanity has an ability to adapt in the face of a crisis. Because markets always forget this. And in fact, they're forgetting it now with the Russia-Ukraine war. They forgot it in the pandemic. But at the start of the pandemic, you had this overwhelming wave of pessimism. I saw some absolutely absurd economic numbers being projected in the markets. And people are just forgetting that humans are very good at adapting. And that, for me, is the lesson of the pandemic. I've seen this time and again after 9/11, after Fukushima. You see people change and adapt according to circumstance. And I think that is the long-term lesson of the pandemic, but it's a lesson that I guarantee financial markets will not learn.
That is some real pessimism there, Paul, but I understand your perspective. I do have some questions coming in from our listeners or viewers, but I do have two more that I'd like to ask you before we open up the floor here. And the first is, I feel like we would be remiss not to talk about the world's second largest economy in our discussion of the global economy here. And so I'll ask you, Paul, to comment, if you would, on the complicated relationship between the US and China. I know that's an impossibly broad topic, so I wonder if you'd simply comment on the aspects of this relationship that you find most intriguing, again, in the short and the long term.
In the short term, I think there's sort of an uneasy stalemate, that China is in trouble in the short term because, unlike the US, UK, and Europe, China's economic response to the pandemic was quite different, in the sense that in the US, UK, and Europe, we were all paid by the government to sit at home, or we had our day jobs. And so we accumulated savings during the pandemic. In China, there isn't really a social security net. So in China, the mirror image happened. And working class families, not middle class families, but working class families in China ran down their savings during the pandemic in order to survive. And then after the pandemic, built up their savings, which meant that domestic demand wasn't really there. And so China then became dependent upon exporting manufactured products into the domestic demand of Europe, UK, US, where we were spending the accumulated savings. Well, that worked fine, but now that that pot of savings has been diminished, now that we're not spending so much, now that demand is normalizing, China hasn't got the external boost, and the zero COVID policy is rerunning on a very more moderate version of lockdown, the process of draining savings and undermining domestic demand. So China has got a problem with its domestic economy, and it's going to need to try and stimulate growth. And I think that this means that, generally speaking, China isn't going to try and rock the boat. On the American side, I think the US administration fully realizes that trade taxes hurt American companies more than they hurt Chinese, because this is undoubtedly the case. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. As a result, with Yellen as Treasury Secretary, finally, we have a competent economist as Treasury Secretary. And no competent economist is going to advocate unnecessarily expanding trade taxes, because it's harmful. So politically, I think it's very difficult for the United States to reverse many of the trade taxes. Maybe the cost of living situation will encourage a little bit, but I don't think we're going to get very much there. But the point is that we've sort of got this stalemate in the near term, I think, between the two sides. Longer term, I am concerned that this is going to be an increasingly fraught relationship, partly because I think the mentality is increasingly divided. The focus is very divided. The economic nationalism in China is really very, very strong. I find it quite astounding talking with Chinese business people about the enormously overwhelming mercantile and nationalistic approach to economic policy. I mean, it's sort of like reading a 19th century British textbook in terms of the attitude. It's very out of place, I think, in the modern world. The United States, at least at the moment, has adopted a more global approach and a less nationalistic approach, a more holistic approach, which I think is appropriate. But that does create potential sources of tension. In addition, I think that the tension is going to be exaggerated by probably two things. The first is, I think, that China is going to increasingly have problems in adapting its economy to the fourth industrial revolution. China's economy and its economic structures are very much set up to succeed, and succeed overwhelmingly, in the third industrial revolution. And arguably China was one of the most successful economies, albeit a little bit late in the day, in transforming itself through the third industrial revolution. But the problem with that is that the conditions for success in the fourth industrial revolution are completely different from what you needed in the third. And I don't think, well, the policies that China is currently implementing are taking it in quite the wrong direction. On the US side, I think there is also a problem that there is, I think, a real risk of the fourth industrial revolution in the United States, a country which has got relatively sizable inequalities as a starting point, is going to encourage scapegoat economics and prejudice politics. Now that is a sort of a two-stage process, because in an industrial revolution, society changes. That's why we call it a revolution. Some people do better, some people do worse. And you will find that people that are doing worse are going to be saying, well, it's not my fault I'm doing badly. And of course, from a personal perspective, it's not. You're turning up to work, you're doing your job to the best of your ability. It's not your fault. But the universe has conspired against you. But of course, you tend not to see that. And your instinctive response is, it's not my fault I've lost my job. It's not my fault my income, my social status is falling. It must be the fault of immigrants, women in the workforce, foreigners, whatever. You pick a scapegoat. And of course, China is a terribly convenient scapegoat in that perspective. And then you go into prejudice politics, where politicians stand up and say, well, vote for me, we'll deal with China, and we will immediately turn the clock back to this mythical, glorious past, and everything will be fine. And in all countries around the world, not just the United States, in all countries around the world, we are seeing evidence of prejudice politics coming in. I mean, Le Pen in France, for goodness sake, Brexit in the UK. But we are seeing this in the United States as well, where different groups are being attacked. And so my concern for the longer term is that as China confronts a fourth industrial revolution, it's not at this stage well suited to dealing with. And as a relatively unequal United States confronts the social upheavals that are necessarily attendant on a fourth industrial revolution, the two countries are going to pursue policies that naturally become economically antagonistic. And so that is, I think, a concern for the medium term.
A lot to unpack there. Thank you, Paul. So, Paul, I'm going to do something a little bit unorthodox here. I'm going to tell you what the last question is going to be, and I'm going to ask it at the end of the call after we've turned it over to some of our listeners here. I'm going to ask you in a few minutes to tell us what you're watching that none of us are. In other words, what do you see when you look out at the world that none of us, that's not on our radar? But don't answer that now. I want you to think about that. For now, I'm going to go to the audience here and ask some of the great questions that are coming in. One of them, and I'll try to get to all of these, so we'll move quickly here, but one of them is referring to the Fed. This comes from Edward Lewis, and he asks, what is the likelihood that the Fed overcorrects and that the US ends up in recession in late 22 or early 23?
I don't think the US is going to end up in a recession. I think there's still enough momentum left over from the reopening story. Low-income Americans have got rid of their savings. They've spent them all, but middle and higher income Americans still have savings, abnormally high savings, which they can use. You know, as long as we keep James Bullard away from setting Federal Reserve policy, I think all will be well. Having said that, I think the risk of recession, not in 2022, but in 2023, has been increased. Now, this isn't specifically the fault of the Fed or anything like that. It is more that the quality of economic data has deteriorated. Economic data was already actually fairly low quality in the States before the pandemic because, quite simply, nobody fills in surveys. During the pandemic, people just gave up entirely, and they've not gone back to doing it. The BLS, sorry, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, published data on survey response rates. It's below 50% now. So, in other words, if you fill in a survey, which then feeds into economic data in the States, by definition, you're weird, because normal people don't do that. Now, what that means is we've got poorer quality data in real time. Over the longer time, we can use big data, we use tax returns and other things to improve the quality. But in real time, we're not really sure what's going on with production, with growth, with trade, with employment. None of this is really certain. And the number of revisions has gone up, and the size of the revisions has gone up. And that means that the risk of the Fed making a policy error must also have gone up, because they can't be that certain about what's going on in real time. Now, I don't think it would be an overwhelming policy error. I think within 3 or 4 months, they'd realize the nature of the mistake, they'd be able to pull back from it, and that's why I wouldn't go into a recession as a base case. But it means that if you are tightening policy with less certainty about what's going on, inevitably, I must have a higher recession risk in 2023.
Thanks, Paul. And for all those people who have filled out a Bureau of Labor Statistics survey, I'm sure that Paul didn't mean to call you weird there, and I don't take it personally. So next question coming from, I'm just reading verbatim here, Quanta Dawn Light. Why is there no serious and effective public promotion of conservation, which can lead to 40% reduction of energy use and pollution, still keeping a comfortable life for people as it was in the 70s and the 80s?
Depends on the country, because I think in Europe there is a lot more emphasis on conservation and more efficient use of energy and so on and so forth. We've got campaigns to turn down the thermostats. You've got a lot more focus on energy efficiency in terms of heating, insulation, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot more about this. It's also noticeable, for example, in Europe that you tend to find that when energy prices go up, the average speed on motorways goes down. People start driving more slowly. We don't drive at 70 miles an hour. You drive at a fuel-efficient 55 miles an hour, that kind of thing. And people are very much aware of this, and they do modify their behavior. I think in the United States, this has been just less embedded in society. It may well be that this comes in more, and again, in conjunction with some of the other structural changes, things like online retail are more energy efficient because it's more efficient to have one guy drive around with a truck and deliver to 30 houses than for 30 people to drive to the store and drive back again. So there are, as it were, below the radar efficiencies that come through. But a lot of this is cultural and the willingness to follow government advice and so on and so forth. Europe has a culture, UK as well has a culture where there's more willingness to do this. The full-scale extreme of this is Japan. And again, it's an example of people adapting in the face of a crisis. After the Fukushima disaster, there were all these dire predictions that Japan was going to have rolling blackouts, companies were going to have to leave Japan because the shutting of nuclear power stations would mean the country couldn't function. And none of that happened. And why was Japan able to avoid all of that? Well, I was in Japan shortly after Fukushima, visited our office in Tokyo. All of my colleagues were wearing kimono or shorts and a t-shirt. Years of therapy to get over the fight. And the consequence of the Fukushima disaster was everyone turned off their air conditioning units and adapted their behavior. And the government said, we need to be efficient. And everyone was right, we must be efficient. Turn off the lights, all the rest of it. And it worked. Now, Japan is an extreme example where that sort of conservation mentality was already embedded in the national culture. Europe, perhaps less so, but is also there. And the US isn't quite there. It takes time to get there, but it can get there, I think. We're not, the US perhaps needs a little bit more of a nudge in this direction.
Sure. Paul, we have a few minutes left, and so I'm going to ask you to answer this very. Two people asked a similar question. I'm going to read them to you, both on energy in the transition in Europe. From Mark Maluski, he says, if Europe needs to find new energy sources to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, is it looking at not only other fossil fuel suppliers around the world, but also building domestically its already impressive renewable energy sources? And Jose Daniel Anito, on a similar topic, writes, do you think that the recent decisions of countries such as France and Germany to reopen build nuclear power plants rather than a short-term measure could be a permanent measure to reduce their energy dependence on external suppliers? So sort of related questions for you.
So I think, yes, there is. I mean, there's always been this drift towards renewable. As I said, in the UK, up to 50% of energy can be from wind power and renewables, plus nuclear already. And the UK has got very aggressive carbon footprint targets, which means that, yes, we will be doing more of this. I have solar panels on the roof of my house here, and I was looking to buy further solar panels to put on my pool house. And the company is saying, we're so overwhelmed with orders, we can't do site visits. Tell us what we want and we'll tell you how much it's going to cost. The trend is very definitely there. France is already essentially nuclear. It's, off the top of my head, it's 90% of their energy comes from nuclear. They're fairly well established and are sort of sitting there being smug and saying, look, we had the long-term plan. Germany is rethinking the process of shutting nuclear, and the Greens, who are now, of course, part of the coalition government, have backtracked on their position and are, what they're actually doing is closing nuclear power stations more slowly. So they haven't actually gone right the way back, they're just closing more slowly. I think, though, that there will be a more meaningful national debate about what they should be doing. Because, of course, one of the really peculiar things was that when Germany started shutting its nuclear power stations, one of the ways that it dealt with that was to buy more nuclear power from France. They would just ship the electricity in from France. So it wasn't actually changing anything from a nuclear perspective. It was just not in my backyard. So I think that there will be conscious attempts to accelerate long-term solutions, and Europe is taking a more integrated approach as well in terms of financing this, pan-euro area, debt issuance and so on to try and facilitate this process.
Thanks, Paul. So I apologize to those of you who've asked a question that we haven't had time to answer, but we're almost out of time. I see that Megan's on the screen here. So Paul, I'm going to end with this last question. I warned you, so you've had some time to prepare, although you were talking the whole time. So the final question is really, Paul, when you look out at the world, what are you looking at that we're not?
So I'm looking into the void. I'm looking at where we don't have information, because that, I think, is increasingly the interesting area. And again, at a time of structural change, this is where you've got to look. So the official labor market data in the United States, I'll use this as an example. Official labor market data in the United States shows very low labor force participation from 16 to 24-year-olds. They're not working. And no one can really understand why they're not working. And so I look at what's not in the labor market data. You know what's not in the labor market data? If you're an 18-year-old TikTok content creator pulling in $2,000 a month by doing stupid 30-second dances to a TikTok audience. Now, I do not understand TikTok. I am far too old to understand TikTok, but it's a career. Well, not a career, but it's something which is lucrative. And if you're an 18-year-old student, why would you want to go and work in Starbucks if you can prance around in front of your mobile phone camera for 30 seconds and pull in $2,000 a month? And so I think looking at what we are not capturing in the data, looking at what our data collection methods are simply too antiquated to get hold of, that is going to be the important story. And I think one of the telling signals about how big the void is comes with tax data, because the official economic numbers will very often miss things. We all know tax collectors never miss a thing. And so what we have been seeing in recent years and accelerated in the last 3 or 4 years is the fact that tax revenues are consistently coming in far better than expected across many, many economies. And that's because the underlying economy is actually doing a lot better than the official data is capturing. So what I'm looking at is the void, because that's where the really interesting stories are to be found.
Fascinating. A great answer. Thank you, Paul. The other takeaway for me that is on the positive side is the persistent adaptability of humanity, which I think you're right, is something that we forget. But it is encouraging in the midst of all of these awful things going on around the world. So Paul, thank you for your time. We truly appreciate it. I'm going to turn it back to Megan to close out the call.
This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you to Paul and Paul for joining us today, providing some clarity, your insight and your vision. We are so grateful. And I can't wait to listen to the recording of this again. There was so much great information. So I want to thank you all for being with us, and encourage you to make sure to follow what we're doing at the World Affairs Council. We have a lot of great announcements coming up soon. So thank you to all of you, and everyone have a great day.